Okay, there's a whole long list here. I'll go over a couple of them. BCP is budget change proposal. Budget BL is budget letter. That gives instructions on how to update or to submit the BCP. The budget office puts out budget letters for BCP concepts. The Department of Finance puts out budget letters for BCPs themselves. BY is budget year, and that is the next fiscal year, which starts July 1. So it'll run from July 1, 2022 to June 30th, 2023. CO is capital outlay. That's expenditures for acquiring land and to construct buildings. CO BCPs are BCPs for cap outlay projects. CY is current year. We're currently in fiscal year 21-22, which runs until June 30th. DOF is Department of Finance. FL is finance letters. And that's in spring, we have another opportunity to submit BCPs. Most of them should be going in for the Jan 10 budget, which means we're working on those now to be ready to get them submitted to finance to be ready for Jan 10. But spring finance letters go out April 1, which means they're developed in around January. See, fund is the fund source. Fiscal year, that's, as I explained, July 1 to June 30th. LAO is the Legislative Analyst Office. They review the BCPs after they're released by the administration, and they'll often submit questions to the department and want, a walkthrough. So we usually set up meetings after BCPs are released to go over the BCPs with them. Alleged BCP is a BCP looking for funding based off of an enacted bill. So if we had a bill that requires us to do something, we submit a BCP within 10 days of the bill being chaptered to the Department of Finance to ask for the resources to carry out that new workload. MR is May revise. It's kind of like spring finance letters, but it's released in May. This is usually very limited in scope, but over the past couple of years, we've been submitting a lot more requests for whatever we weren't able to get into the spring finance letter in May revise. OE&E is operating expenses and equipment. So those are things like general expenses, contracts, rent, printing, communication, just the things you need to support your operations outside of staffing. PY is prior year, so that's before the current fiscal year we're in. Org or business code is organization code. For CDFA, that's 8570. REF is reference code, and it's a 3-digit code, and it lets you know what type of expense it is, whether it's support or local assistance or capital outlay. And then workload PY, personnel years, that's identifies the amount of staff being requested within the BCP for the current year, budget year, and budget year +1. Let's see. And do we have Prashanta yet? If not, I'll go on to the next section. Okay. So the next section is an example of a budget letter from the budget office. And that basically lays out the timeline for the BCPs. We give a due date. We talk about what the purpose of BCPs are. Actually, this is for the BCP concept. So this one is related to concepts for BCPs. Those were due a couple months back, and they basically give a summary of what we want to request. Those are submitted to the budget office on a template. We review them, edit them, make sure the fiscals look good, and then we submit them to the executive office. And with those, the executive office prioritizes and lets us know which BCPs they want to go forward with. Let's see.
So, quick question.
Yes.
What a BCP concept would that fall under, needing to add staff members or fund a project, or what would fall under a BCP concept? What would be an example of that?
So it's anything you want to submit a BCP for. So anytime you need additional resources, so more funding or more positions, you would submit a BCP concept to let exec know that you want to create a BCP. This basically lets us filter out things exec wouldn't want to go forward with without going through the whole process of creating the whole BCP.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. We offer biweekly meetings for concepts as they're being developed to let programs ask questions or run drafts by us to let us know or to seek out input to see how they're doing. And then
when do these happen? How do you get involved in them?
What was that?
I said, when do those happen typically?
So they were due April 25th. And then we met with exec, I think at the end of May, to discuss all the concepts. Yeah, so we met with them. Sorry, when did we release this budget letter?
This one says
April 4th. So yeah, so we released it April 4th. And then programs had about 3 weeks to create their BCP concepts and submit it to the budget office. And then a couple weeks after that, we meet with exec to discuss all the concepts. So we have an example of a BCP concept. And we give this template out when we release the BCP concept budget letter. Basically, we want the really important things are we want to know the fund source. This one was general fund. The estimated cost of the BCP. So this is just one position for $113,000. We give a little summary of what the request is. We identify the problems that we're hoping to address with the BCP. And then we talk about the adverse consequences if we don't fund this. Like what bad things will happen if we're not able to fund this request. And then a history. Typically for the history, we want to know if BCPs have been submitted in the past related to this issue and what the outcome of that was. And then after the BCP concept is the example of Department of Finance's budget letter, which gives us instructions on deadlines. And we get lots of different budget letters from finance in the fall. This one talks about the deadlines. Let's see. Let's go to page 9 is where they talk about budget change proposals. They tell us which template to use. A lot of this is more for the budget office's purposes rather than programs. So this is what we use to make sure we're compliant with what they need. On page 11, it talks about general guidelines for BCPs. They talk about conforming to budget policies. They have another budget letter, which outlines the administration's policy for what types of things they want to fund. And it's usually very restrictive. It points out that everything is confidential until the BCP is released. Everything is confidential in what we're working on. So we can't go out to stakeholders and say, hey, we're working on this BCP. You could ask questions to guide you in developing a BCP, but you wouldn't say it's for a BCP. If a BCP is not approved, we can't talk about it outside of the department. That remains confidential. Any reductions to a BCP would remain confidential as well. BCPs must be approved by our secretary. If they have an IT component, the chief information officer would have to sign off on it. Let's see. And talks about chaptered legislation, which we mentioned earlier. Oh,
I'm reminding you.
sorry, getting an Alexa reminder. Okay. And if you're using ag fund or any type of special fund, we want to include a fund condition statement. The budget office can help you in putting that together. And that basically shows how much you have available to spend out of basically your bank account. So how much you've collected in revenues versus what you've spent and how much your remaining balance is. Departments must provide a succinct, well-written, and complete BCP. The one thing I'd really like to note on this point is succinct. Well-written and complete is good too, but they're reviewing a lot of BCPs. We don't want to give information that's not relevant to the argument we're making for the funding. We want to be very precise and succinct in what we're putting together and sending to them. Number 11, include all appropriate documentation. So that includes like workload for the positions and any code sections that that outlines our authority to do what we're requesting. Number 12, we don't need to do a priority number. In the past, they've required it, but then they stopped requiring it, but their budget letter still says they require it. But we still internally prioritize those, and those prioritizations are made at the executive level. But if your division is submitting several BCPs, it would be a good idea for the division to prioritize what they feel is important. Number 13, BCPs must describe the methods of calculation and sources of data for all numbers. This is important. Finance likes to look at numbers. They like to know how many widgets one staff person can do, and from that, how many staff we need. So if, as much as you can quantify what you need, it's always good to include that in the BCP request. Requests for new positions or programs must include both the narrative explanation and fiscal detail addressing the impacts of the positions and programs. So in your narrative, you want to talk about how much you're getting and how that's broken down in a narrative form. But also we have fiscal detail sheets that we ask programs to fill out, which breaks it down by category. Number 15, BCPs must be consistent with the department's strategic plan. So you talk about what part of our strategic plan the BCP's addressing and how it addresses that. 16, BCPs must include a discussion of at least a few alternatives considered. They want a minimum of 3. Usually it's fund the request as we submit it, don't fund the request, or fund it, a portion of it for this part of the workload, or fund it from a different fund source. And it really depends on what you're requesting, what that third alternative would be. You could say, seek out federal funds. From there, I think the rest You could read this separately, but the rest is mostly stuff that the budget office would need to consider. And from there, I'll turn it over to Taryn for the annual budget process.
Hello, everyone. My name is Taryn. I'm the lead of the budget office, and I'm going to discuss the annual budget process. So this is when the executive office has signed off on any budget change proposals that have gone through, that they've gone through the budget office, they've gone through the whole process. They've been signed off and they're given to Department of Finance for now review. If Department of Finance has approved the BCP and they're good with it, they'll include it in the governor's budget. From there, BCPs are not released until the governor's budget is released on January 10. Once the governor's budget is released, Department of Finance then includes all BCPs on their website for anyone in the public to view. From there, it's given to also the Legislative Analyst Office, which is LAO, as a second set of eyes beyond Department of Finance. Once everything is released and everyone is starting to look at them, that's when you start getting the Assembly hearings and the Senate hearings that you see from us. There are two subcommittees that our department is under, and each subcommittee on both the Assembly and the Senate have a chance to look at all of the budget change proposals. From there, they can ask questions before hearings, they can ask questions during hearings, and they can request information after hearings. If everything looks good, the Assembly will vote on our BCPs, and if they approve, then they move on the Assembly side. If the Senate approves them as well, they both get included into the governor's budget for it to be signed by the governor. However, if the Assembly and the Senate don't agree, then they take those differences that they have and they go to what's called the Budget Conference Committee. From there, the Budget Conference Committee looks at the differences and they discuss what they'd like. If everything is approved on both sides, changes are agreed upon, then it goes to the final budget package. If things still are not agreed upon, sometimes they go to what is called the Big Five. The Big Five is the governor, Speaker of Assembly, Senate President pro tempore, and the minority leaders of both houses. Once everything is hashed out, everything looks good at that point, then the final budget package is created and developed, and then it goes to the governor for approval, so that way we can start with that budget July 1st. The governor does have line veto control, so if line item veto, so if there's any changes that the governor would like to make, then they can go ahead and go through and line item veto. So there still can be changes all the way up until the very end if there's something that is still not agreed upon. It's been a while since that has happened, but we like to let everybody know that things aren't completely finalized until the governor has signed off on it and the bill or the final budget package is signed and chaptered. So this is just kind of like once your BCP is approved by DOF, this is the format that it goes through before it is finalized in the final budget package. And now I'm going to turn on back to Nathan for the screen test.
All right. Thank you. The screen test is a list of questions that the Department of Finance uses to evaluate BCPs. There's 26 here. Is the BCP consistent with the administration's policy? Does it clearly identify in quantifiable terms a problem or need that to be addressed by public subscription? Is the problem a real problem or just a symptom of something else? Does the BCP solution directly attack the problem? What or where is the basic authorization for the proposal? That's the statute that mentioned earlier. Like, do we have the authority to do what we're requesting? Are we required to do what we're requesting. In what approved program does the change occur? Usually this shows up in the background history of the BCP, which we'll get to down below. What are the current program goals, objectives, and measures of effectiveness? This is a mix of a couple sections of BCPs that we'll address below. What other programs, units, and departments are impacted or affected? If a new or expanded program, have all funding alternatives been considered? They want to make sure that there's not some other funding source that can pay for this outside of the general fund. Or even if it's special fund, they want to consider all the different special funds that could pay for it as well. How does the BCP rank compared to current alternatives or other BCPs? So they'll look at the alternatives and see, do any of these other alternatives make sense instead of approving the BCP as requested. If a reduction, elimination, redirection is proposed, how will the form or function problem be addressed in the future? This is a very uncommon one. Usually departments don't ask for a reduction. We're usually asking for more money. So our program objectives stated in quantifiable enough terms to recognize when they're met. So we want to be able to say, if we get this funding, these are the things that will happen. And they want to be able to quantify them to a point where we'd be able to tell if we are successful in what we're trying to do. We'll talk about that later in the training. What are the quantifiable measurements of output? How will the results be evaluated? What are the risks or uncertainties of the proposal? Basically, why should the BCP be funded? What's in it and for whom? What are the existing staffing standards and workloads? Are computations accurate and do they follow accepted standards? Have viable alternatives been identified and discussed? What are the constraints or assumptions in the alternatives? What are the impacts and costs of alternatives? Has the best alternative been selected? Are inputs based on least cost combinations? Our future year program fiscal commitments spelled out. So when we submit a request, we want to identify the ongoing costs along with the immediate cost of the program. What are the consequences or adverse impacts of not funding the BCP? This is really really important to make sure this is identified in your request. Like, what bad things happen if we don't submit this BCP or if we don't fund this BCP? Department of Finance is looking at hundreds of BCPs, probably 1,000 BCPs statewide, and there are a lot of problems that departments are trying to identify. So we want to be very clear what problems will happen if we don't get this money. Have spillover impacts been identified and described? And that brings us to the BCP itself. So once exec says, okay, let's go forward with this BCP, the budget office will send out a template, which is this template here, which you will fill out all the sections. And we're going to go over all the sections in detail below, but this is the basic template. Let's see. 1 second. Yeah, so this is the basic template you'll be provided to fill out. And I believe Alex has, oh wait, no, I have the cover sheet. So we'll go down to an example of a BCP. Actually, the cover sheet. So if you guys are following along on the PDF, you could have the BCP template up, and then I'll talk through each of the sections of that cover sheet. So the fiscal year would be the next fiscal year, the fiscal year that we're requesting funding for right now, we're working on 2023-24. The business unit, again, is 8570 for CDFA. The department is Department of Food and Agriculture. Priority number, we're going to leave that blank. Budget request name. For this one, let's see. I want to make sure I'm answering the right one here. Budget request. Oh, the budget request name, the budget office will fill out. So this is a series of numbers, and it's based off of when we put it into the system, it generates a number that this 074. And then the rest of it is like a standard number. But we will be filling out that number, so you don't need to worry about that. Program, subprogram. So this one, if you don't know your program, the budget office can fill it out, but we have 6570, 6575, 6580, and 6590. And then admin exec has its own as well. Budget request, let's see, description. So this is going to be the title of your BCP. You want to make it clear what the proposal is about just by the description. You know, it can be a few words like Be Safe program, which, you know, Department of Finance, the legislature is familiar with this because we're requesting one-time funding for an existing program. So they already know what that is based on that title. But if it's something they're not familiar with, you might want to add a little bit more to it. But it shouldn't be, you know, sentences. It should be like probably 10 words at the most. Budget request summary. This follows a very standard form. You basically want to say the California Department of Food and Agriculture requests X fund source fiscal year to do Y. So in this case, it's one-time funding. So it's $2,138,000 general fund in 21-22 to do this. And we always follow that same format. So if you're doing a BCP, please look at other examples and follow those examples because that's the format we're going to be using. Does it require legislation? Most of the time it's no. Do you need to change statute to basically carry out what we're requesting in this BCP? Examples of situations where you might need a statute change would be if your revenues are declining and you need a statutory change for those revenues. You could click yes there, and then you'd have to submit the language for the change as well with the BCP. But usually that's a no. Information technology, this only applies if we're requesting funds for an IT project. This one we would typically get from OITS itself, so you probably wouldn't need to do this. We would check with IT on this, where they are in the project lifecycle, any project numbers and approval dates. Does this BCP impact any other departments? If yes, we want to, it depends on the BCP, but sometimes exec would reach out for this and sometimes the programs themselves, depending on how close of a relationship you have with those other departments. So if it does impact them, we would want a letter from them saying that they agree and they support our proposal. Usually this is a no. And then the last sections are filled out by the budget office. Oh, except for prepared by would be whoever wrote the BCP. Reviewed by is usually a division director. Kevin Masahara usually signs the department director, and then Secretary Ross would sign the agency secretary. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alex for the fiscal detail sheets.
Thanks, Nathan. So the next page in the training material, page 27, has an example of the BCP fiscal detail sheet that is included in our BCP packages to DOF. We do have an Excel version of this that can be provided by your budget analyst that'll include the same information, and you can plug in your specific numbers to go along with the narrative problem you're addressing in the BCP. It'll have salaries and wages for the positions that you're requesting, benefits, and then all your OE&E will be listed out according to the 4-digit account code rather than the 7 digits that you'll see specific costs. So we budget a slightly higher level. All of the numbers here are rounded to the thousands. So the total request summarized at the bottom for this example is the 2 million one-time funding, and you can see it split by budget year +1, budget year +2. So we have 5 years of budget year data to include in the BCP. So if it's ongoing, you can fill in all of these columns. But in this case, this one is one-time funding, so we've only got data in the budget year column. The bulk of this request is the 1.7 million for consulting professional services. And in this case, for this example BCP, that's described in the narrative. That's the county agreements. It's got the fund source. So general fund is the fund number 0001. And then this one was coded to general agricultural activities. The next page will have your positions. Generally, you'll have all the classifications here with their 4-digit code. This one says various rather than a specific classification, but all of the classifications we request would be here separated out. We calculate salary and benefits based on a mid-step. So to get that, you can go to CalHR's website. We look at the pay scales for each specific classification, and we do a mid-step calculation. So bottom step plus the top step divided by 2 multiplied by 12 to get a full year for each position or classification, and then multiplied by however many of each classification you're requesting. And we do have an Excel template if you are working on a BCP that your budget analyst should be able to send you that will automatically populate staff benefits based on the number of positions and classifications you've put in. And the way that it does that is the next page has a staff benefits rate table. We update the template with these numbers every time the Budget Act is signed. We have a new retirement rate. We calculate current year dental, health, vision costs. And we also have, based on our Schedule 8, the average salary for the department that we calculate estimated costs for benefits based on costs of positions. And this is updated every year and is available on the SharePoint under the budget offices section. We've got, I think, all the way back to 2018-19 if you need historical benefits rate data. This could also be provided to you by your budget analyst if you need it. And then specifically for the operating expenses and equipment portion of the fiscal detail, if there's a difference between budget year and budget year +1 or out years, you can describe it in the methodology here. Generally, you would describe the methodology for whatever amount that you're including. So for this one it doesn't specifically tie to that Be Safe example, but they would have the consulting professional services here for their 1.7 million, and they would describe that in the methodology. That and then if your program has travel costs that differ from first year to second year or whatever out years you need, you can describe that as well. And unless I missed anything, I think it's Taryn for the budget summary.
Okay, so one of the most important things that we have beyond justification is the budget request summary. So this is the first thing that anything outside, so Department of Finance, Legislative Analyst Office, Assembly, Senate, all of that is the first thing that they look at. A lot of the times, this is what is copy and pasted into a lot of forms, or if it's part of the Assembly hearing or a Senate hearing, the first thing they look at. So the budget request summary is just basically what are you asking for and why. It's a pretty concise 3 to 4 sentences explaining what we're asking for in the terms of how much, what is the fund source, are we asking it for, you know, ongoing, how many positions we're asking for, and why. So the example that we gave is for the Be Safe program. And so at this time, for this particular budget change proposal, we're requesting one-time funding of $2,138,000 general fund in 2021-22 to continue the operating of the Be Safe program. And then it kind of goes into what the Be Safe program does or what this funding will do. A lot of the times this paragraph is also copy and pasted on the front template as well. On page 22, there's that, it's titled the exact same thing in our training material. It says budget request summary. So a lot of times this will match the cover sheet. So again, it's just what we're asking for and a concise description of why we're asking for it. The next section, and again, we're following each section. This is described, each section is described more, but the form is on page 23 and 24 if you want to follow along, but we're going through each section on those pages. The next section is section B. This is background and history. So basically, this is just what is, so in this case, this is the Be Safe program. So we're just wanting to give the history of the Be Safe program. What is the Be Safe program? What does it do? What has it done in the past up until this point? How much money have they been given in the past? How many positions? It's just a way to let the legislature know and everyone to know what the current program does, what their history is. Has there been any code changes that have affected the program over time, that kind of thing. One of the things that we do provide is called a resource history table. So if scroll down just a little bit for me, Alex, you'll see here, it's a history of the program itself, and it goes down to what's called the resource history table. This is a breakdown of what we had budgeted for authorized expenditures for the last couple of years, how much was actually spent, positions that were requested for this program, how many of them were filled, and vacancies. This is a time where also you could have a workload history as well, where it explains, this one particularly doesn't, but it will explain maybe what the workload has it increased. For example, border stations, if that's something we're looking at, how many vehicles have been inspected over the last several years. So it's a good show of the increase in vehicles that are being inspected and maybe why we need new positions. That's just an example. That's something else. This section is really just for background and history. It's not where you go into, okay, you see this progression, this is why we need funding. That's more of a justification, and we'll go into that later on. This is just creating the baseline of what the program does and what have we been progressively needing or doing over the years. And from there, I'll give it to Nathan for the state level considerations.
I just wanted to point out Chris Cox's comment. Thank Thank you for mentioning that, Chris. If you do want to request funding for an IT project, contact IT as soon as you know you want to do that, because the Department of Finance will not approve BCPs for any project that hasn't gone through stage gate 1, which is kind of a way of evaluating our existing program, our existing IT solution, and then kind of giving a basic framework for what the project will look like. So if you do have an IT proposal, contact IT immediately before, even coming to the budget office, because if we get an IT request, the first thing we do is check with IT to make sure they're working with you on that. All right. So state level considerations. This is basically to make sure that what we're requesting is following the states and the departments' policies, priorities, and initiatives, following our strategic plan. Who else in the state is impacted by this? What other departments? What other groups? Now, and then whether or not those departments are working with us or they have their own requests. And this is to avoid duplication of work, because in the past there have been examples where 2 different departments submitted requests related to the same problem. And that really doesn't look good if it goes to the legislature. It makes it look like the administration's not talking to itself. And this one did a really good job at identifying all the different groups we're working with. If you scroll down a bit, they talk about the ag commissioners, the California CACASA, beekeepers associations, and they just spell out who's being impacted, who we're working with, who's impacted by this. And you can see they talk about our strategic plan, what it is, what part of our strategic plan this impacts, along with our mission, what part of our mission, and then how it meets that requirement. And then from there, we can move on to justification. So the justification is really the meat of the request. It's basically saying why we need what we need to accomplish what we say we need to accomplish. And this is in conjunction with the workload analysis, which we'll talk about later. So you want to provide information to support the recommended solution to the problem that requires a change in resources. You want to talk about what workload or policy changes have occurred that require us to request these resources. If there are positions, you want to talk about the workload necessitating not only that you need positions, but why do you need that specific classification, and why do you need that many positions? Like I said earlier, finance likes things quantified. So if you're able to quantify a workload, it goes much farther than having something more generic. And then the program workload measure tab must be completed to support the request. What was that?
Get a free hoodie.
Oh, I think someone's mic is just on. Okay, so, and then if you're requesting new positions, you want to include an org chart. So some of the things you want to ask and answer in the justification is what workload changes have occurred, and how will this proposal address the workload changes? How will the proposal address or solve the problem? What are the adverse impacts if the proposal is not approved? Be realistic in the assessment. You don't want to say, the world's going to end. You want to try to accurately identify what problems will happen. Why is the solution the highest and best use of resources? Why does this have to be done now and can it wait? That is a really important question to ask because, with all the different problems that the administration is trying to solve, if this can be delayed a year or two, it probably will be delayed a year or two. And probably should be. Why do we have to do it now? That's a very important question. What relevant and current facts and figures support the recommendation? Provide the methodology used to quantify the program proposal and objectives. Why should the administration prioritize this request over the department's other program activities, including those activities that rely on the same funding source? Again, they're evaluating different proposals with different harms and needs. So we want to be clear why ours is important and deserving of funding. How is the proposal consistent with the use and purpose of the funding source requested? Are there other funding sources that could be used for this purpose? Our funds are usually ag fund, federal fund, or general fund. So if we submit a general fund request, finance is going to say, they'll look at the program's current funding. And if we have some ag fund, they'll ask, why can't we use ag fund for that? And then we'll have to go down the path of like, does this provide a general benefit to the state versus a benefit to these specific stakeholders that are paying revenue into the ag fund? What's the public need for the request? Does this benefit the public at whole, or just specific stakeholders? How does the proposal affect external clients? Identify positive and negative effects. And if we have letters of support from stakeholders, again, we can't say we're developing a BCP, but if we have a letter talking about the new workload or the new problem, that would be good to include as well. And we would pass that along to finance. How does this address a long-term or short-term need or a combination of both? So a lot of times the first year of a proposal will be more than the ongoing cost because there's a lot of times there's one-time costs for staffing or an IT system or some kind of study or whatever. So we want to be clear about the time frame of the funding we're requesting. What's one time versus what's ongoing? What are the legal implications of the proposal, past and future? This one's doesn't come up often, but will someone be sued if we don't do this? If we do something, does that have a legal impact to the department or the state? What actions from other governmental entities are required for implementation? Do we need the feds to approve federal funding for this request? So a lot of times we get a BCP where we haven't gotten federal funding approved yet, but we think it's coming. So we need to identify what the status is of that. Does a law need to be added, amended, or repealed? So if we do need to do that, we want to attach the statutory changes. Why should the state assume responsibility for this change? Is it the state's responsibility to do what we're requesting, basically? Or should it be on the federal government, local entities, private entities? What clientele is being served? Who benefits? And are there examples from other states or institutions where this or similar approaches have been undertaken? And then we also give the example from the BSafe BCP, if you want to read through that separately. But again, this does a good job of hitting a lot of those points, especially for this one, because we requested funding in 1819 and they gave us limited term funding and they wanted us to report on certain outcomes from the program. So there's a lot of detail related to what's happened over the past couple of years and what needs to happen ongoing. So this is a good example if you're writing a BCP to look through what they did here. All right, and with that, we come to outcomes and accountability.
So the outcomes and accountability section is where we can include some metrics. Like Nathan was talking about, Department of Finance likes to have quantifiable metrics in the BCP. This one will address how improvements or changes can be measured, what controls are in place to ensure the appropriate use of requested authority, how will the resources be accounted for and monitored, and will there be progress or outcome reports. Specifically in this example for Be Safe, they talk about the contracts they are setting up with counties or county agreements for enforcement and inspections of the apiary to prevent theft. They talk about the county submitting a monthly activity report, so that's one metric there. All of the activities that the counties are going to be performing are listed out in this section. This is where we have the projected outcomes, which is that Taryn mentioned earlier, that we can include some metrics here for what activities the funding will allow us to do or accomplish. And we can tie this into our workload analysis for requesting positions as far as how many hours are required to complete some of these tasks. The next section, the analysis of feasible alternatives. This will give options for DOF to look at, but basically the first alternative we always want to have as our basic, what the proposal is or what we've been including the justification and everything so far. So it's the full amount that we're asking for. We want to include the advantages. This is going to include some similar language maybe to what you had in your justification for why we need the funding or positions. We want to have disadvantages for each one. For the first one, we want to have fewer disadvantages because obviously we want them to choose alternative one since that's why we're writing the BCP. So we say for this one, it only increases the obligation to the general fund. And then for alternative 2, you want to do the opposite. So you want to say the other alternative is to not approve any funding at all. The only advantage would be that there's no obligation to the general fund. And this is where you want to include some of that language about what consequences would occur if the proposal isn't approved. So this one talks about $5 billion almond industry, that the loss of bee colonies due to theft would impact. For alternatives number 3 and 4, you've got more options. You could potentially recommend approving a portion of the total request. This one talks about just approving the amount for the county contracts so that we could have that work completed, but then explain the disadvantages to only approving that portion, so there would be no statewide coordination. You can also include in an alternative if there's an option for other funding, as far as if we could get industry funding maybe, or if we could get federal funding approved, and then the advantages and disadvantages of that. But focusing on what the disadvantages or why it might be a problem to get those. We want to make alternative 1 look like the best alternative. And then the next section is the implementation plan, and that is Taryn.
So the implementation plan is just how do you, if you were to receive this funding, how would the plan look to utilize the funding? So in this example, we gave for the Be Safe program is July 2021, they would start to execute the county contracts. And then they would schedule the training sessions that were needed to do the inspections for this program. It basically, this is going to be is just a timeline of how the funding will be utilized. This one has ongoing, so it's going to continue to provide statewide coordination and work with industry to develop a strategic plan for long-term sustainability of this program. So in here, so what is the timeline for implementing fees, changes, entering into contracts? This would also be the time of when, usually for hiring positions that are requested, hiring to fill the positions requested. Those ones we usually say as of July, whatever the fiscal year will be, begin hiring positions. This is also a time where are there any approvals? So is the proposal dependent upon federal actions? What are the anticipated timeframes for that? What is, if we're asking for space or facilities, how will we go about getting these once the funding is approved? Leasing, capital outlay projects, that kind of stuff. What is the timeline to acquire, modify, and occupy office space? So this is just, again, just a brief timeline of how you're going to spend the funding for this. The next section is the supplemental information. The supplemental information is just what are the special resources that are needed to support this proposal. Usually what goes in this section are any pieces of equipment we're needing, like if there's vehicles, if there's special, if it's a lab purchase, what type of laboratory equipment that's needed, that kind of thing. Also, it would be the consulting and professional services. So here, this is talking about the contracts that we'll be entering into with the counties at a total of 1.7 million. So when you go through the fiscal detail sheet that we have, it would be whatever is described there that you have for contracts that you're consulting out to other entities. It would also be as well as if there's any space and facility needs, what leases, how much a lease would cost, that kind of thing. So it's just breaking down the special resources beyond your basic operating expenses and equipment, like computers, things like that, and the how you're hiring to fill the position. So it's the other things beyond our basic operating expenses. And on to Nathan for the recommendation.
So the recommendation basically changed in the last year or so. So the example we have here is how we used to do recommendations, where we say, we're recommending alternative 1 to do this. Now finance wants us to say CDFA recommends alternative 1, period. So it's a little simpler now. So if you're doing a BCP, you could put in this, or you can just do the simple alternative 1 recommendation, and we'll make sure it's the right format before we submit it to finance. From here, we could go on to cap outlay BCPs. Oh, wait, sorry. We have our workload analysis. So this is very important if you're requesting staffing. Basically, for each classification you're requesting, you want to submit one of these workload analysis templates to the budget office. It talks about, it'll say the division, the branch, and then it always starts out with under the direction of, and you list out the supervisor, and then you say the classification will do this. And then down below, we list out each task and give a description of what that task entails, along with how many times they would do the task, and then how many hours the task takes, and then that gets you the total number of hours per year. We want to make sure we're being reasonable on what tasks are listed out, along with how long they take. And we want to make sure it's ongoing workload too, because a lot of times we'll get a task of, updating regulations, and that might be a huge part of the workload for a new program. but that wouldn't support the ongoing workload. And sometimes with Cal Cannabis, for example, for some of them, we did 2 different workloads, one for the first year and then one for the ongoing workload. But usually we want to stick to one workload for, the first year and ongoing. So just be careful that to make sure that your tasks are actual ongoing workload. You want to also include a rationale, or you can see here the 107 restricted livestock drug licenses. They're doing 1/3 of the total. That means each year they're going to inspect 1/3 of their total population. And it can vary depending on what you're inspecting. I know some of our audits are, once every 4 years, once every 2 years. So it really depends on how vital it is to do that task each year, or how often you need to be doing it. So then for after you list out all the tasks, you could scroll down to the bottom, please, Alex. You get to the total workload or total number of hours, which magically equals 1. So then down below, we have 1778 hours, and the total number of hours worked, assumed to be worked by a state employee, is 1778. That equals 1 position. And this one can be tricky, like this task can be tricky. So if you need help identifying some of the tasks that you should list out, or basically how to format this and any type of questions, you can reach out to your budget analyst and we'd be happy to help on this. But this is, very important. As we mentioned several times, finance likes quantifiable numbers. All right. And with that, we'll move on now to cap outlay BCPs. All right, so cap outlay is expenditures of funds to acquire land or pay the cost of planning and construction of new buildings or additions to and modifications of existing buildings, and the equipment which is related to such construction. So this is basically if you're going to buy land, buy a building, construct a building, do significant modifications to one of your buildings, that would be considered capital outlay. And that's a whole separate process, and there's a whole different budget office budget letter related to cap outlay. Usually we get a series of one-time appropriations. There's usually a small appropriation to do a study, which we hire DGS to go out and estimate what the total cost of the project would be. And then from there, we request funding for preliminary plans, or no, acquisition, then preliminary plans, then working drawings, and then finally construction. Let's see, and we could probably just, well, one important thing to note, if you have a construction or cap outlay project in the works, like in your mind coming up in the next few years, you want to make sure that gets added to our 5-year plan. That basically says, this many years out, we want to do this, and we lay out what's going on that necessitates either the construction or the purchase of a new facility. And that just flags it for finance to know it's coming in the future, and then they can look into it more if they want to, or they can just leave it there and just wait for us to submit a BCP. But it's really important, if you have something coming up for cap outlay, that we add it to the 5-year plan. And Whitney Cotton is our cap outlay analyst. So if you have anything in the cap outlay realm, please reach out to her. So this talks about how COBCPs are very different than budget change proposals. They use a different template, which we'll go through below. We don't request any support costs. That means we're not requesting staffing. So if you build a brand new facility that's much larger than your existing facility, you're probably going to have more staff. Like a new border station will have, 3 or 4 or 5 extra lanes. We don't request the funds for the staff to man those lanes, but we would do that separately. The focus is not on the operations of the program, but instead the facility and the infrastructure need for the program to function within the facility. The COBCPs are developed to obtain funding to procure or pay non-CDFA employees to perform work. So usually we use DGS to act as a project manager for the projects, and then they will hire contractors like architects and construction companies to actually carry out the program. They're very structured phases in cap outlay. We'll talk about those a little bit below. Even if funding's not necessary, and we almost always have to have funding for a cap outlay project, but there are situations in the state where land's donated. I used to work at the Department of Parks and Recreation. Every once in a while, someone would donate land. I would still have to go through the COBCP process just to get the authority to accept that land. And then here's Whitney's contact information. So if you have anything coming up related to cap outlay, please contact her. And then next up, we have the template for cap outlay BCP. And I think I want to skip down to just the example of the COBCP because they did a really good job in meeting all the requirements of the COBCP. So a lot of the information is similar to what's in the normal BCP, like fiscal year, business unit, department. They'll have their own budget request name, which the budget office will fill out. The program ID, you could leave that blank along with the project ID. We usually work with finance to do that. Project title should be similar to the BCP project title. Whoever's reading it should basically know what you're requesting based off of that title. Project status and type. So if this is a new project where you haven't done a study or anything on it, you click new. If you've already received some funding for the project, you click continuing. Usually most of our cap outlay projects are major. And I believe the threshold for minor is, I think it's around $1 million, but I'm not sure, but the exact amount, but we would confirm that before submitting a request. But most of it's major. Like all our labs usually cost upwards of $60-70 million. Same with border protection stations. This next section, usually it's critical infrastructure. Most of these others don't apply to us. If we're updating a facility, you could click on facility modernization, but usually it's CRI. So this next section, total request, this is what we're requesting right now, the 10.3 million. And then we're talking about which phase is being funded. This is acquisition and preliminary plans. Usually it's one phase at a time, but the border stations have to work with Department of Transportation, and some of the different phases get a little blurry and blended. So we had to request funding for 2 separate phases at once. And then the total project cost, this would be all the phases combined. What's the total cost of the project? Usually if we're starting out fresh, new project, we're requesting funding for a study. That's usually about $250,000, and we won't know the total project cost at that point. But once DGS does the study, they'll give us their estimate of what the total cost of the project would be. So budget request summary is very similar to the BCP summary, where you're saying we're requesting this amount for this purpose. Usually doesn't require legislation. Let's see, is anything else? Usually does not require provisional language. Budget package status. So budget package, that's basically the study. Have we done a study for it? Like, do we need it? Is it not needed? Or has one been done, which would be existing? Impact on support budget. So as we mentioned, you're not getting your support costs from a COBCP, but there are sections where they want us to identify what the support impact would be in the future. So once this new facility opens, we'll need 10 new staff, $1 million per year or more ongoing. So they want us to try to estimate what that support impact would be. Usually there's not future savings because we're usually making a facility bigger. Usually yes to future costs. Again, if it impacts another department, do they concur? And then prepared by, reviewed by, so Kimberly prepared it along with Keith Morris, and then Nick was division director at the time, approved it. So then moving down. Okay. So the COBCP abstract, if you want to go back and look at the template, this is all spelled out in the template, and this program followed the template very well. You basically saying what we're requesting, and then gives a description of what's being built. Talks about how many offices, how many lanes, how many, I think it talks about how many booths. They have air conditioning, how many square feet, total project cost, and it breaks it down by what they think the cost would be by phase. And then it talks about the timelines for each of the phases. Okay, and then going down farther to purpose of the project. Now this is where I think they did a really good job, because they start out by talking about, what the border stations do, who they work with. They have cooperative agreements with people. You could scroll down more. And then they break it down by the problem. It's an infrastructure deficiency for the state. It was constructed in 1966. It's too small for the existing need of the program. Things are falling apart. Program need, it's too small. They need a bigger facility. The deficiencies, they list out, like there's a safety need. They talk about it being too small again. And they show the traffic flows over the years. When it was constructed, well, this isn't even when it was constructed. This is going back to 1992. It almost doubled from then to 2019. There's bypass routes. The infrastructure is not adequate. ADA issues. So relationship to the strategic plan. This is similar to the statewide impacts, but we want to point out where in our strategic plan this is impacted and how it's impacted and how it supports our strategic plan. Alternatives. So the first one is the one that we're basically requesting. We want to relocate the BPS to a new facility that we're going to construct. And these different underlined categories are in the template. So we want to give a summary of the scope. We want to talk about the cost and the funding source. We usually start out with general fund and let finance tell us that it's something different. A lot of times, different phases are funded with different pots of money. Something like acquisition and preliminary plans might be general fund, and then the construction would be bond funded. But that's up to finance to tell us the funding source. But we usually start out just requesting general fund. Program benefits, they say it'll improve their program's ability to exclude undesirable invasive insects. So we want to say not just like, it's a nice new facility that we'll be able to look at all the traffic that's coming through at the appropriate rate, but beyond that, we're going to exclude invasive insects and plant diseases. So that's the benefit, is the actual things that are being excluded that are protecting ag industry in California. Facility management benefits. This one's, it's really dependent on what the proposal is. Like this one talks about ADA, talks about the increase in traffic, so there'd be less queues waiting to get through the facilities. Impact of the support budget. So this is what I was talking about earlier. They recently opened a facility outside of Vegas at Mountain Pass. It was a larger facility, so they're saying like that one, it'll require additional staffing because they're running more lanes. All right, so then number 2, upgrade the current facility. So they talk about what it would take to upgrade the current facility and why that's not feasible. Really, you can't really upgrade the existing facility because that's being used, by staff, and they wouldn't really be able to do it without shutting things down, rerouting traffic, and it would just cause a lot of problems. Also, the existing space isn't enough to build to increase the existing facility to the size it would need to be. And they go through each of the different categories that they went through above. Option 3, continue just using the existing facility, but maintain it. And again, that's not really good for the program because of the expanded traffic going through the area. You just want to spell out why these different options are not really good enough and why we want to go with option 1. Okay, going down, recommended solution. So this one, we do want to spell out why we're recommending alternative 1. Because the template actually asks for that. And then we want to give a detailed scope. And this is similar to what was given in the description above, where it's saying 2 office buildings, number of square feet, number of, let's see, canopies, number of booths. And then there's a timeline laid out below. Usually when we do a study, DGS will give us a basic timeline that we can provide. Basis for the cost information, they reference the study. Factors, benefits for recommending a solution other than the least expensive alternative. And we want to basically point out that the least expensive alternative does not meet our program's needs and why it's important that we go with what we're requesting. Complete description of impact on support budget, like we mentioned above. Very similar. Identify and explain any project risks. Let's see. Was this Blythe? Sorry, I forget, because we've done a number of them. With the Blythe facility, the way it was laid out is there was a bypass route within a mile of the state border. So there was very few options of where we could build it. So that would definitely have been a risk. If this is the Blythe proposal, it probably should have been brought up there. So if you know of any risks associated with the construction, you do want to put them there. It's better to come out with it when you know it rather than having it come up later. List requested interdepartmental coordination. This is DGS and Caltrans because it's on a road. Usually it's just DGS. Except CAFIS would also be, like a CAFIS lab would include CAFIS and University of California. Infill. So yeah, you can't do infill on a highway. But if it would be something to consider if it works for your program. I know the CAFIS labs they don't want to be around a lot of a very populous area. So they want to be a little bit outside of town. So you'd want to explain why you wouldn't be utilizing infill. Does the project improve the protection of the environmental agricultural resources by protecting and preserving the state's most valuable natural resources? For this, yes, the whole point is to protect agriculture. Does the project encourage efficient development patterns by ensuring infrastructure associated with development other than infill support efficient use of land? So that's really dependent on the project. Usually we go through a pretty comprehensive process to pick out which land we want to acquire for the projects. I think when we did the Turlock site selection, we looked at like 15 different properties, and we tried as best as possible to meet some of these requirements, but because of the unique nature of the lab, it didn't really fit into those criteria. So it really depends on what you're trying to build. And then please scroll on. Any common pitfalls? Okay. And that would be Alex's section.
Thanks, Nathan. So this is the last section of the training, and it just outlines some things to think about or mistakes to try and avoid. Well, the first one is not meeting deadlines. I know we have the deadline for submitting BCPs or COBCPs. They're always in the budget letter, but your division may have its own internal deadline that is ahead of that. So you want to make sure you're meeting that so that they can get it to us by the deadline that we have outlined in the budget letter. A lot of these are related to specific details or quantifiable needs. We want to make sure as much as possible that we are outlining exactly what resources we need and what problems we are addressing with those resources as specifically as possible. And any step along the way or any questions you might have while you're working on it or reviewing BCPs, you can reach out to your budget analyst and they should be able to help you. And we have a list of contact information at the back of the packet. So at this point, I think we can open it up to questions. If anybody has anything specific that they'd like us to go over.
Any questions? I know we tried to address them as they came up in the chat, but If anyone has any additional questions, please ask them now. Someone's raising their hand. Yes, Fernando.
Hey Nathan, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. A quick question. I think it was in the beginning of the presentation. I know there's a process where it goes to assembly or Senate. Is there a specific duration or timeline for response or getting the results? Whether if they're in agreement or disagreement, whatever it is.
Yeah, so usually if a BCP is included in the Jan 10 budget, they usually have hearings in March. And if there's no issues with the BCP, both sides might approve it. But if there are questions they have, concerns they have, that could get dragged out until June. And then, and that's, at that point, they usually come to some kind of compromise on the outstanding issues. So sometime in the range of March to June, you should know what the outcome of your requests are.
Awesome. Thank you, Nathan.
You're welcome.
Was there somewhere in the beginning of the presentation that had like a timeline for budget proposal concepts due, review, submission, etc., all the way through the process?
I don't think we listed out a specific timeline. I know the BCP concept budget letter did it for the concepts. And it's not something that's the same every year. Let me see if I could track down the timelines for. Okay. So I think we notified programs which BCPs they were going to be creating the beginning of May. No, it was, let's see. Yeah, so we notified programs of which BCPs they could go forward with on May 20th. And then the BCPs are due to the budget office July 8th. And then from there, the budget office has a couple weeks to review them and then route them through executive office, and they're usually due to finance early August. And that timeline's not the same every year. Finance bumped that timeline up recently. It used to go even towards September when they were due to finance. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for attending this training. Again, if you're working on a BCP, really stay in contact with the budget office if you have any questions. We'll even sit down with you and just go over each section specifically tailored to what you're working on. Yeah, once again, thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.